In addition to our written columns, which are archived at danielgordis.substack.com, Israel from the Inside will also be posting a video series on the history of Israel, as well as regular podcasts that will shine light on a variety of subjects that make up the mosaic of Israeli life. In this episode, taken from a Zoom presentation that I did for an American community, we're providing the first of two presentations on what led up to the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas. In this video, we'll look at the more distant history that set the stage for the conflict, while in the second video, we'll come to the more immediate perfect storm that precipitated the outbreak of violence. You're welcome to share this video. It's easily accessible on YouTube, and you should feel free to share the link with anyone who might want a brief introduction to understanding the background of this sad but critically important conflict. This is obviously a very, very complicated story, so I'm going to do it with some degree of alacrity, but just to give you a basic sense. And I want to say a word for a minute about why it matters so much that we have this conversation about history. In other words, why do we have to have this conversation at all? Why can't we just talk about the issues as they are now? And I want to suggest to you that it's really important for us to think about the metaphor of the United States for a moment. Imagine that somebody said, we want to understand Rodney King, or we want to understand something going on in race relations in America, but we're not interested in all that history. That happened a long time ago. But of course, we understand that that's absurd. You can't understand what's happening in America today with race or with anything else if you don't know where it all came from. If you want to talk about race, you have to talk about the history of the Civil War and Jim Crow and the Reconstruction and the Great Society and so on and so forth. It's just part of what you need to know in order to be able to understand whatever your opinions about the issue might be, in order to be able to understand how America got to where it is. And the same thing is true here in Israel today, and here in Israel and Gaza. We need to know how we got where we are. The history really does matter, because people who pick up the story yesterday or last week or last year or even 10 years ago are doing so without much context. So let's go through it relatively quickly. How did we get where we are? You probably know that the State of Israel was created by the United Nations in 1948 with basically indefensible borders, and it was attacked by 5 different countries: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and even Iraq, which did not share and does not share a border with Israel. Israel was able to eke out a victory in that war, and it captured some territory that it didn't have. It did not capture Gaza. Gaza at that point was part of Egypt. It was filled with people who had lived there for a long while, and it was filled with people who had fled the fighting. Some people fled the fighting, Arabs that is, fled the fighting to Gaza, some fled to Lebanon, some fled to Syria, some fled to Jordan. Many stayed inside what's now Israel and became Israeli citizens. But those who did not stay inside and fled to some other place found themselves as kind of stateless refugees in one place or another. And that's where Gaza was. It was filled with some of those refugees and some people who lived there before, and it was entirely under Egypt's control from 1948 until 1967. 1967, the Six-Day War breaks out. Israelis are very, very worried that this war really could be the end, because Israel was going to be attacked by Egypt and Syria, Egypt being the most important Arab power at the time, and probably still the case. And there were all kinds of black humor jokes, the last person out of the airport, turn off the lights. Thousands of graves were dug across the country. It was really, people were really prepared for a disaster. But as everybody knows, or as most of you know, things turned out very, very differently. And Israel was able in 6 quick days to triple its size. From Egypt, it captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. From Jordan, it got what's called the West Bank. And from Syria, the Golan Heights. Now, that's more or less the way that things stayed from 1967 until 2005, because even when Israel signed the peace treaty with Egypt, Egypt did not want the Gaza Strip back. That's really very important. People talk about giving Gaza back. When they talk about giving Gaza back, they think they mean to the Palestinians. But in fact, before Israel controlled Gaza, Egypt had Gaza. And it was only when Menachem Begin was elected prime minister in the early 80s, and then Israel and Egypt, in the late 70s, 1977, and then Israel and Egypt finally signed that peace treaty in 1978 and 79. Egypt said, we don't want it back. By the way, in the same way that Jordan, when it signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1994, also said, we don't want the West Bank back. People talk about giving the land back, but back to whom? It would be actually back to Egypt or back to Jordan, neither of which actually wanted that land, because it's, as we can see, a very complicated set of places. So even when Israel signs a peace treaty with Egypt in 78 and 79, it stays, the Gaza Strip stays with Israel, and it stays that way until 2005. The next major change in Gaza's status is in 2005, when Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon pulls out of Gaza unilaterally. He made a decision, very controversial decision in Israel, that the cost in bodies was too high. People were dying in Gaza, soldiers and Jewish civilians alike. There were about 8,000 Jewish Israeli civilians living inside Gaza. Some people call them settlers, some people call them just Israeli citizens, but they were living in a variety of towns. Sharon pulled them all out in the summer of 2005. Israel destroyed the towns and villages, repatriated all of those people back into Israel, some more successfully, some less successfully. That's a very complicated and painful story in and of itself. But what happened on the Gazan side of the border? Israelis hoped that, as painful as getting out of Gaza was in 2005, as hard as it was to watch these people weeping, being led away by soldiers and having their houses bulldozed, houses that were really houses with backyards and front yards, and there were small shopping centers, and there were synagogues, and there were cemeteries. I mean, there was a real life there. Israelis, as much as it was really painful to watch all of this get bulldozed, were very hopeful. Maybe now that we're out of there, Gazans are going to go to the polls, and they will actually elect a leadership that finally, at the end of the day, wants to make a deal with Israel. Now, again, we have to kind of telescope all of this in very closely, but what happened at that point is that instead of electing a government that wanted to try to make a deal with Israel, through a very complicated electoral process, which again, we can't go into right now, Gazans ended up electing Hamas. They ended up electing Hamas, which had in its charter, and still has in its charter, that its goal is the destruction of the state of Israel. When Hamas says, chanting in the streets, we're going to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is what they mean. And they mean that there's going to be no Jewish entity anywhere in the Middle East, not the West Bank, not Israel, not Gaza, not the Golan, nothing. And it's really very important for people to understand today that that's what this war is. In many ways, what this war was these last 2 weeks, and they were 2 horrible weeks here in Israel, what this war really was, you could say, is the latest battle in the War of Independence. Because the War of Independence, which went from 47 to 49, was really a war in which Israel had to fight off enemies who were committed to its not being able to exist. When Israel had to fight off the 1967 Six-Day War, it was attacked with the express purpose of destroying the state of Israel. When Israel was attacked in 73, it had to fend off armies from the north and the south, or it would not exist. And there's been many wars and many battles since then. And in each case, the enemy had a defined purpose, and it was always to destroy the state of Israel. Now, that sounds hyperbolic, it sounds dramatic, but it's just the plain old truth. And I think because Israel's powerful, and because Israel's so successful, because it's a high-tech powerhouse and so on and so forth, it's hard to remember that 73 years in, there are really still people whose express purpose is the destruction of the state. And when Gazans under Hamas say, from the river to the sea, we're going to liberate Palestine, that's what they mean. And because of that, Israel and Gaza have gone to war several times in 2012, in 2014, now in 2021, and tragically, there will be more. Because Gaza keeps accumulating these rockets that it fires at Israeli cities, barrages, as you could see this time, to try to outfox or outgun the Iron Dome system, which actually performed admirably. It's an extraordinary thing, by the way, that 4,000 rockets were fired at Israel, and only 12, I believe, only 12 civilians were killed. We'll come back to the question of whether or not that shows that there was a kind of an unfair balance of power. But that's sort of how we got to the situation in general. Israel and Hamas have been at war since 2005, since Hamas took over. Before that, Israel controlled Gaza from 1967 on because Egypt didn't want it back when it signed the treaty. And before that, Gaza was Egypt, basically filled with people from all over, but also people who had become refugees when they fled the fighting in the land of Israel in 1948. And that's kind of the long-term background. You know, how did we get here 70 years ago, 60 years ago, 50 years ago, and all that? What happened now? I mean, why did this thing actually blow up now? And here we can say there was really a kind of a perfect storm. In our next episode, we'll look at the perfect storm that immediately precipitated the outbreak of violence. To receive notice of written columns, videos, and podcasts as they're posted, sign up at danielgordis.substack.com. Thanks for joining us.